Welcome back to my channel, guys. Today I want to talk about a topic that fascinates me that has nothing to do with my usual content. But you know how I am with this channel. Sometimes something topical, something in pop culture, like the recent America's Next Top Model documentary on Netflix, also fascinated me. And then I feel this urge to talk about it, the way that people on Reddit want to talk with each other and find like community around these niche topics. So we'll see how you guys feel about this, diving into this subject. But the reason that I'm particularly fascinated by it right now is that I'm in the midst of watching a show called, a docuseries called The Vow, and it's about Nexium, a cult that you might have heard of. By the way, the show's about 5 years old and it was on HBO. And I want to say it was exposed like right before COVID, if I remember right. It was all over the media. Some of you might remember. There were some like B-list celebrities that were associated with this cult, including Allison Mack from Smallville. If you guys remember the show Smallville from the early 2000s, she was in this cult. And one of the big things that stood out way before this documentary ever came out, and I remember hearing this in the news, was this idea that many of the women in this cult were literally branded like cattle, like an imprint on their body as part of the mental sort of coercion, and the subservient nature, of course, of cult members. I'm still watching this series. There's over a dozen episodes, so I haven't finished yet, but I'm finding certain parallels with other cults that I've heard of and research out of curiosity. And it's just so interesting to me how it's always the same themes over and over. So I guess first I want to kind of summarize the deal with this show and this specific cult, but then also like bird's eye view, talk about this idea of cults in general and how, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but I'm at an age now in my 30s where I realize that there's actually a lot of parallels between cult culture, if we can call it that, and just general society. We associate cults with ideology and religion and religious belief systems. But the older I get, the more I realize there's cult-like elements all around us in politics, in the workplace, in terms of national culture, like nationalism. So that'll come later. First, let's talk about Nexium. So Nexium, which is not the easiest thing to say and also kind of looks weird when spelled out, which I've noticed is also a theme with cults, that there's a whole lot of like word salad and phrases that don't really mean anything. And then it's like secret coding and all this stuff. Fascinating. But Nexium was founded by this guy, Keith Raniere. Now, I've heard some people, even in the documentary itself, call him Keith Raniere. Keith Raniere. I've heard both. I'm just going to call him Keith Raniere because it's easier on the ears. And this guy's your typical cult leader. By the way, he's in jail now. So let's start with the good news. He's in jail for life. All the typical cult crimes like trafficking and stuff like that. Keith Raniere is your typical cult leader in that he's depicted, or was depicted in this cult, as this like genius, this genius kind of messiah that's here to change the world, and he's all about ethics and compassion on top of being a genius. And this is his movement, and his purpose is to make the world a more ethical place, and a place where humanity can really advance to the next level of self-awareness, emotion regulation. And so there's this element that's sort of like spiritual and all about personal development, which is, again, a classic theme with cults. But then there's also this element to it that's about business, which is, again, typical cult element of, at the end of the day, these people have to make money. And if you get people to depend on something financially, then it's easier to keep them in a cult, right? Because now they need it. It's not just their community, and it's not just about following this cult leader, but now like their finances are tied up in it. So again, classic cult vibes, that it's actually an MLM at the same time. So not only is there this like spiritual element of personal development and human development, but there's also a business component. If you're not familiar with MLMs, they are heavily frowned upon, particularly in today's culture. I don't know that 10 years ago people were talking about MLMs the way they are now, but an MLM is a multi-level marketing company. And so these are actual companies. So this cult Nexium also happened to technically be a company, like a registered company. And the idea with MLMs, multi-level marketing schemes, you might have also heard of the phrase a pyramid scheme. Same idea. There's all these levels to how they market. So oftentimes there's an actual product. In this case, the product of Nexium, the cult in this documentary, The Vow, that I've been watching, the product is really personal development courses. So there's no physical product. It's not like they're selling toothpaste or something. There are MLMs where they literally will sell products like makeup products, beauty products, or like toiletries. But then you also have these MLMs like Nexium that are all about selling modules. That word always makes me cringe, module, because it's such an MLM and cult like term. They always use that term modules, which is really, again, a word salad way of saying classes. You're just paying for classes. And the idea is the more you sell, the more people you recruit into this MLM/cult, the more money you make. But it's a pyramid scheme because if you think about a pyramid, right, the top is the peak. That's where the richest people are, which is basically like the top executives of this MLM/cult, like Keith Rainier. And then when you make your way down to the pyramid, there's more and more people at the lower levels, but that's like the hardest level to sell these services, these professional and personal development courses. But in the meantime, they're getting hustled because to rise the ranks, they have to pay for courses. So essentially, you're sold on the idea that you can make money selling these courses, but in the meantime, you need to also be a student of the courses. So everybody involved is paying some money, presumably, except for, you guessed it, the people at the very top, aka Keith Rainier. So that's the first theme that I want to point out here, how it's like capitalism is always involved in these cults somehow, right? I mean, at the end of the day, these people need to survive somehow, and they're typically isolated from their loved ones and from like mainstream society. So they live in their own little tribe, their own little commune. They need to make money, right? So it's very interesting because it's on some levels, it's like logical that it would evolve into that. But then in other ways, it's like part of the manipulation, which is one of the first questions that I want to pose that I've been thinking about watching this docu series, which is, are there some people who are just kind of wired to be cult leaders and some people are wired to be cult members? You know, I have a therapist friend who always says that relationships always require, well, particularly toxic relationships, like, you know, you hear about narcissistic abuse and stuff like that. My therapist friend will always say, every key needs a lock and every lock needs a key, meaning two keys together, nothing happens. Two locks together, nothing happens. But every key needs a lock. So when it comes to like a cult, same idea applies. It's like a cult leader can only get unlocked, or I guess lock people in, if it's a certain kind of key that he's working with, right? And you see these patterns over and over with cults. So that's my first question. Like, do people like this, like Keith Rainier, do they study other cults thinking, I want to start a cult? Or did they not even conceptualize that way? It's just like they're inherently manipulative and controlling enough that it's like they're wired to do the same exact things, just in a slightly different way. So as you can imagine, this docu-series, The Vow, goes through the process of like, you know, you meet ex cult members who are like, yeah, I was totally into it. I thought we were changing the world. But now throughout this docu-series, you see their sort of aha moment of waking up and realizing what they're part of, and now the difficulty of extracting themselves and leaving, you know, this community behind, and being afraid because of all the typical fear tactics of a cult, like the shame, you know, the fear of losing your livelihood, the fear of losing your community, right? That's a big theme that comes up. It's the sense or the desire of belonging, the desire for community, to feel connected to other humans. That's a huge pull, it seems, for all cults. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, within this cult/MLM, you know, on the surface, for a lot of us, it might already be like weird, odd. they show one of the intro videos in one of the first episodes, and I immediately was put off because I don't know if it's just that I've seen so many of these kinds of documentaries, or if I'm just very sensitive to what feels like narcissism. But one of the first presentations, they talk about how he's a genius, Keith Rainier, and how he speaks all these languages and he does this and he does that. And I've learned in life that less is more. Talk is cheap. Like, you don't need to tell me you're a genius. I will see it for myself if you really are a genius. And in my experience and observation, people who call themselves something are oftentimes not that. Like, if they call themselves a genius, they're probably not a genius. Same thing as I've talked on this channel, when guys call themselves alpha males, it's like, who are you trying to fool? Like, the community, we will know if you're an alpha male, or if you're this, or if you're that. Like, you don't need to tell me what you are. That really is more up to my or public perception of you. So for me, from the onset, it looks weird, this whole thing, like just a basic first impression. And I've had moments in life where I was exposed to communities kind of like this. Many years ago, I went to Kabbalah 101. This is a funny story. I went to Kabbalah 101 to a class because my dermatologist at the time, I had a crush on, and he had the Kabbalah bracelet, the red bracelet. And so I asked him about it when I was, there for a consultation with him, a skin thing. This was back in New York City when I lived in New York City. And he convinced me, he was like, you should come to Kabbalah 101. So I mostly went to like impress him / flirt with him. And I just remember being so turned off by both him and Kabbalah 101 because it wasn't scientific at all. It was a lot of woo-woo language. And maybe that was just that particular Kabbalah class and community. But I remember the instructor there having a presentation, his sales pitch at Kabbalah 101. And one of the things he said was, scientists say we only use 10% of our brain. And in my head, I'm thinking, I know for sure that that's not a real thing. Like, that's something they say in sci-fi movies, and X-Men and Scarlett Johansson superhero movies. Like, that's not a real scientific stat. And during this presentation, he kept showing optical illusions to demonstrate, like, look, there's so much more than meets the eye. And I, as a critical thinker who grew up, loving optical illusion books as a child, I know that that's your brain trying to recognize a pattern. That's not, there's more than meets the eye. It's an optical illusion. I mean, think about how ironic that is too, by the way, for somebody to use the concept of an illusion to try to imply that they know truth. It's like, no, that's actually the opposite of what you're saying. Like, you're showing us an illusion. You're showing us something that is intentionally fake to fuck up our brain. How ironic. So I was very turned off. I never went back to the Kabbalah class, and I was turned off by my doctor too. I was like, you're a medical doctor and you're falling for this shit. And I remember, by the way, looking around me and people are like, yeah, this feels legit. And I was so freaked out by that groupthink concept. So again, I don't know if this is just me being very cynical to begin with and being turned off by like groupthink stuff, but I've had other situations like this. I worked for a company years ago where the founder was, well, I worked for more than one company where the founder was most definitely, where the CEO was most definitely textbook narcissistic, sociopath, all that stuff. But there was one company in particular, which was the most successful company I've ever worked for in terms of like profit. And the guy has like a huge mansion in Beverly Hills, like the typical thing. He was one of the richest, if not the richest man in a certain European country, which I will not mention because I don't want to be linked back to the company and, have a target on me. But this guy, super, super wealthy. And I just remember part of my onboarding for that company when I first started was a presentation on how amazing he is, that he's a humanitarian, all these humanitarian philanthropic efforts, and that he invented a sport and that he did this and he did that. And I'm like, again, watching this thinking, get a fucking grip. Like, you're not curing cancer here with this company. Like, give me a fucking break. That being said, let me tell you about the time I almost fell for an MLM. This is a true story, and maybe that's why also I find this very fascinating. This docuseries, The Vow, from HBO, because it did kind of trigger me in certain ways that it felt so familiar. So years ago, right around the time I started this channel, I want to say a year into having this channel, I quit my job. And I look back and it's like one of the dumbest and yet smartest things I've ever done, in a sense, because I was naive. Being 20 something, I was naive to how privileged I was to have this job. Like, I was making 100K, mid 20s, great benefits, like secure company, publicly traded company. I didn't realize at the time how difficult it is to find that. I got lucky. I got recruited by them and they found me. But anyway, I quit the job because I hated it and I was like, I can do better than this. And I started my own business in social media, which in the beginning tanked and was awful. So I was in this strange, like, soul searching era of my life, looking for purpose, looking for the next step, looking for ways to make money. And again, key and a lock, right? Like, it's so weird that at that time I was already sort of the perfect prey, I guess, for an MLM. But it just is so crazy and absurd that this happened. I went to Las Vegas for the first time as an adult during that time to see a friend who lives there. And we went to a strip club, my first and only time at a strip club. And we meet this girl who was not a stripper. She was a fellow patron. And I remember her hinting at this thing that she's working on the side, that she's building up to monetize and build up, her future legacy for her son. And it was very intriguing because she, in retrospect, again, I was naive to a certain extent, 20 something, looking for my next step. And when I look back, she was definitely trying to, what's the word? Like, seduce me to an extent by using word salad and being very ambiguous. She had me, like, she hooked me by being purposefully vague with the idea of doing something purpose driven that I could make money from. Obviously, hindsight is 2020. I look back and I'm thinking now, like, I was at a strip club at 2 a.m. talking to this, like, what's going to come of this, right? But in the moment, right, when you're inquisitive and curious about something and you also happen to be looking for the next step, it can kind of feel like, oh my God, is this a sign from the universe, right? So that's also important to note that, again, key and a lock. So anyway, long story short, when I left Vegas, she was like, follow up with me in a couple of months if you're serious and we can explore this. She sent me a book to read and she said, don't contact me again until you read the book. And it was a very short book, easy to read, kind of like a fable analogy, like a fable of a mouse looking for cheese. And there's all these, like, lessons in the book, which are interesting on their own, right? If you can learn something, if there's a moral to any story, it's worth sharing, right? That's why I make so many videos, because I feel like there's always a lesson in everything. But I remember then she was like, okay, the next step is like joining one of our meetings. I joined this meeting. And this is, by the way, before I knew anything about MLMs. I didn't know that was a thing. Uh, and I remember that first meeting really turned me off, just like Kabbalah 101, because it was very salesy, but in a disingenuous way. And turns out it was an MLM, a multi-level marketing company. I looked for the name in preparation of this video. I could not find the name of this company. And now I'm wondering if I purposefully was not given the name over, like, email, or I couldn't even find it over text message. I found the girl who I met in the strip club in Vegas. I found my thread with her via text. But this was so many years ago that maybe I don't have the full conversation anymore on my phone. I've switched phones since then. Maybe I deleted the emails. I don't remember, but I found it interesting that I could not track down the name of this MLM. But essentially, it was an MLM that sold household items like toiletries. And again, just like a classic MLM, it's like you need to sell to other people you recruit. And it's sort of this inner community that only buys these products as opposed to buying them, let's say at Whole Foods or at your local CVS. And as a 20-something naive yet still critically thinking person, I remember consciously thinking, but that's it? Like, the purpose is just to make money? Like, that's so superficial. Like, it would be one thing if these were eco-friendly products and it's all about making a greener planet, but like, you literally just want me to spend money on these items for the sake of us all buying the same product. Like it didn't make sense to me. And that's when I Googled and found out that it was an MLM. And I remember also being really turned off by the value system of that meeting that I had. The salespeople in, this was like a Zoom call, and it was just very gimmicky, old school salesy people. And I remember there was like the head honcho and and I looked him up on social media, and I was so turned off by the presentation. It was very performative, very like, look at the life that I've created for my wife and my kids. And it was very gimmicky salesman. Like every picture was like, look at my nice car, look at my nice clothes. And I remember that when I went back to that girl who brought me into this, I was very careful with how I communicated this to her, because I didn't want her to be offended or insulted, but I kind of wanted to be like, yo, bitch, this is a cult. And I remember that she had a kid too. So it was like, I wanted her to lean in to the fact that this is murky, weird stuff, but I knew enough about human psychology to know that if I just blurted it out, she might get freaked out and it might backfire. So in preparation of this video, I looked back at those texts with her, and I had sent her this long, kind message saying like, this isn't the right fit for me. And it's because of like the value system doesn't really align with mine. Like I don't really want to do this for the sake of making money. You know, I would want it to be purpose driven. Like it just doesn't really make sense to me. And I was put off by the social media of the leader and stuff like that. And I just remember that her final message to me was typical cult language, which was essentially something like, you're very nice and thank you for this feedback, but yeah, we know this is not for everybody. It takes a special kind of person to understand what we're doing. And that's exactly a theme with Nexium as well, the cult from this docuseries that I've been watching, where there's so much shame language to keep people in the cult, but also to isolate those outside the cult who just couldn't understand. So that's my MLM story. Again, before I ever heard of MLMs, and before all these documentaries, by the way, existed even. But nowadays there are so many documentaries on cults, and you see the same patterns over and over and over. So again, it's easy to look at this from the outside and just be judgy, right? And say, I would never fall for that. And I do think it takes a certain person, a certain kind of naivete and vulnerability, like that MLM that I mentioned that had cult-like elements in terms of how they try to like reprogram you, and they try to target a certain kind of value system as well. I think that only certain people get hooked by that. Like you do have to some extent, have what I would call superficial values of wanting to make money through something that's not necessarily ethical. But at the same time, with Nexium in particular, they're also sold on the idea of making a more ethical world, right? So it's sort of like this murky thing where they manipulate you into thinking that you're doing it for the right reasons. And there's a saying that keeps coming to my mind as I'm watching this docu-series, and really any cult documentary, which is, a broken clock is right twice a day. Meaning, of course, from the outside, this cult looks crazy and there's a lot of things that don't make sense. But I'm sure that the members of this cult and other cults, they're aware that certain things are kind of bizarre or off. For example, with Nexium, they all kiss each other on the lips. Male, female, male, male, female, female. Like it's a thing. It's very intimate, which for most of us would be off-putting to see that here's this community where they all kiss each other, right? But again, once you're in there and you see that it's all about compassion and all of that, you might think, oh, well, this is a different way to show intimacy and support. And they talk in the documentary, the ex-members, about how certain things were life-changing for them, like certain things they learned about how to regulate their emotions, like certain exercises really genuinely helped them be better public speakers. And I feel like that's also a theme with MLM type organizations, that they make you really good salespeople, which is helpful in the real world in terms of, again, public speaking, in terms of job interviews, in terms of networking. But they do that so that they can bring more money to, again, the top of the pyramid of these organizations. So it's like everything has a motive and everything is intentional. But yeah, a broken clock is right twice a day. Certain things will benefit you personally, but the vast majority will not benefit you personally. And there's really two themes that have stuck out to me. One of them I've already mentioned in this video, this need for belonging, this need for community. And I think in America in particular, this is a huge theme because a lot of Americans, I find, as somebody who comes from a different culture, I'm half French, half Turkish, many of you know this. The cultures I come from, there's a very distinct culture. Like there's culture around food, traditions, and that kind of national culture does bring people together. And although you can argue that there are elements to American culture, like let's say the Super Bowl or Thanksgiving, there are many isolating elements to American culture. One of them is just geographical. I mean, it's a huge country, the US. It's a capitalist country, which means that there is a sense of individualism. Like individual freedom is very much celebrated, and there is a beauty to that, of course. But what that also inherently means is there's less of a need or emphasis on community, whether community through family, through religion, through national or ethnic community. And so if you think about the classic tactic of a cult, which is to isolate people from their loved ones or from their partners and keep them sort of sequestered in in this cult, that's a great way to kind of force somebody to be tethered to this community that becomes their world. Like a lot of these people then end up finding romantic partners within the cult, and they have kids within, this cult. I mean, look at Scientology, right? People are born into Scientology. And so if that's the world, it's a lot harder to question what's happening and be a critical thinker about it, because then you have to question everything. You have to question everybody's intentions, and you have to question the world that you live in. And it's like, are you in a simulation within the real world, or within a bigger simulation? Like that can totally fuck you up. So then the idea of potentially leaving that is scary for so many reasons. But there's another theme that I've noticed. All these cults, and this I think applies to the real world. It's something I see in the workplace too, and just in my personal life with friends. There's a theme of male validation, of needing male validation from everybody, not just the women, but the women in particular. You see it. Hence why this cult leader, Keith Raniere, was able to get to a point where he had like subcults within the cult. And one of them was called DOS, which literally stood for like dominion over, or dominant over submissive, or something like that. This is not a joke. These cult members would literally call each other slave and master. So these are everyday people who joined this organization, to create a better world. And now they're caught up in this MLM. And suddenly, well, not suddenly, I'm sure it's a gradual sort of mental manipulation, but now they're calling people literally, you're my slave, you're my master. And I feel like to even be able to get into that mindset of being comfortable with that, it's like you're seeking his validation. And then there's now this sub-validation of your master, right? Everything is about this like hierarchy of status. Ironically, for me, the most sort of jarring and goosebumpy cult member is not the leader himself, not Keith Raniere, but Allison Mack, who I grew up watching on Smallville, which is like such a random reference, Smallville. It's like, when is the last time you heard of the show Smallville from the early 2000s, which of course is based on the Superman comic book. Smallville is where Superman grew up. And anyway, there's a whole show. And Allison Mack, to me, watching this documentary is very like triggering, because she's always like this. She's always smiling, and it feels so fake to me. Like there's something very performative about her. And they show in the documentary, in the docuseries, they show her first meeting with Keith Raniere, and you see her very quickly latch on to him. And she says something like, "You just popped my cherry," in terms of thinking about something a new way. And I'm like, wow, this girl's like the perfect victim for a cult that like so quickly she caves. This guy said one thing somewhat interesting, and she vocalizes a sentiment that otherwise is only used in sexual context, popping a cherry. And for a cult leader, she doesn't know he's a cult leader in that moment, but he's obviously like, oh, she's in, like, I got her. And of course, Allison Mack, who, for me watching this, it's just so obvious that she's like always playing a character. So that's also interesting that like these cults oftentimes recruit actors who, of course, make great salespeople because they're always sort of in presentation mode. But of course, she becomes his like main, sort of like the Ghislaine Maxwell, we'll say, to an Epstein. She becomes the top sort of recruiter of other women, particularly for this dark and disturbing subcult DOS that I mentioned, with the branding and the master slave dynamic. So I was not surprised at all that she was like his head honcho of this, because, and the other thing is, you see her in the docu-series getting skinnier and skinnier when they show footage of her having been in the cult. And of course, that becomes a thing too, that eating habits are controlled, particularly for the women. So everything is about control, everything is about manipulation, but you see her getting thinner and thinner, and you realize that, again, I think it's related to this idea of needing validation. But the really screwed up part is that then these people perpetuate that on other victims, right? So the shame they're feeling and the need for validation from, in this case, a male figure, Keith Raniere, they then project that onto each other and to women onto other women. And this is something I've noticed in the workplace, by the way, in general, that oftentimes the most toxic people you meet, it's like a certain kind of female personality where they want the validation of the toxic men at the company so badly that they're willing to mimic them, to the point where it's like even more disturbing, because you know that they're mimicking, and they believe that that's what ultimate power looks like. Whereas the men who are like that, I think, are genuinely just like toxic and lacking self-awareness. But somebody who's self-aware enough to want to become like that for me is very dangerous and disturbing, because they know what they're doing. They want to emulate what looks like power to them in an alpha male. By the way, I should mention, I should have mentioned this earlier, I forgot, but what I also find so interesting with these cult leaders is that oftentimes they're so unimpressive. Like when you look at Keith Raniere, he has this like shaggy hair, kind of like me. I shouldn't talk, I guess, but mine looks a lot. Frankly, I know some of you have been dissing my hair recently in videos, okay, which I don't care, because I think I look good, okay. I think my hair looks healthy, thick, full of volume. But Keith Raniere looks like disheveled to me. Like he just doesn't look. He looks unkempt. He looks like, you know, the college student who hasn't slept in 3 days because he's been writing a paper, but he's like a grown adult man. He's not a college student. He just looks sort of what's the word? He looks kind of frumpy to me. He also doesn't really have much of a neck. He's just like this short, little, awkward, stout-looking, hobbit-like man. I also find him peculiar in that when you see him interacting with others, you see him sort of scanning people, but it's not scanning in a destructive or what looks to me like a predator at all. I don't see any like intensity in his eyes where he's, you know, where you see evil. And so that's interesting to me, because I assume that I would see that the way that we have seen that with some cult leaders like a Charles Manson, or just criminals in general who are like, there's nothing there. Like you see a vacancy. Sometimes you hear about psychopaths and you look into their eyes and there's nothing there, right? I don't see that when I look at Keith Raniere, but there is an eeriness in how when he's interacting with people, he has this like gentleness, um, which I could believe would be alluring for women, that he comes off as a gentle man, his voice and just the like a levity to him and the eye contact. But what I also see is that he's always analyzing. So that's very interesting to me. But again, he's very unimpressive. And this reminds me of the last cult documentary I watched on twin flames, if you guys are familiar with that. And I remember going on Reddit after I watched that documentary, and people kept ranting about how the cult leaders, this couple, but really it's the man in charge, of course, typical, um, that he's so uncharming and unimpressive and uncharismatic that people are like, how could you fall for this? Like, he's not even like an interesting salesperson. So I think it's interesting that Keith Raniere, it's the same thing where this guy's not that stimulating or interesting, and yet he has these people hooked. Because if you think about it, these people are sort of groomed before they even meet him, right? Whether it's a video they watch or somebody who's bringing them into the fold, they're told that this guy is like a genius and that he is so advanced cerebrally, that it's like they've already been pitched some version of him before they meet him. I've also noticed that these guys often look the same. They always end up growing out their hair and oftentimes a beard. I can't help but wonder if they are trying to emulate like a Jesus sort of imagery, a Jesus imagery, both to plant themselves in cult members' minds as somebody prophetic, but also because if you think about it, the image of Jesus, there's sort of a gentleness and an androgyny, I would say, not just the hair, but just a gentle sort of energy that, again, I actually do see with Keith Raniere. And it makes me wonder if that's part of the manipulation to make women feel more at ease, who of course become the biggest prey for these leaders, because then there's a sexual component. And so it's not just about mental control or brainwashing, but it ends up becoming like a harem for the cult leader. So this begs the question again for me of, you see the same patterns over and over with cults slash what's called high control groups. And I'm assuming the reason people use this phrase of high control groups or mind control groups is that it sounds more gentle than a cult. Like if you tell somebody they're in a cult using the word cult, they might be so put off by that terminology that they can't receive it. But so you'll find this term online if you look into this and research it, the idea of high control, because it is all about controlling people's habits, controlling how they think, controlling how they make their money, control who they hang out with, which obviously is just a cult. But when you do your research on all this, you do find these patterns over and over and over and over. And it makes me wonder, are these people, these cult leaders, are they wired to just be predators in this exact way? Or do they all study each other? I did see that Keith Raniere spent a lot of his youth studying MLMs and certain cults. So that makes you think, okay, he's trying to emulate something. But I just find it so bizarre that it's always the same themes, and then once they get exposed, it's always the same kind of denial, and the same sort of tactics of gaslighting. It's just so specifically consistent that makes me really wonder if certain people come into the world being wired to behave a certain way, regardless of culture, regardless of socioeconomic level, regardless of where they grew up, regardless of, the decade or the time in universe. It's just so peculiar to me that you see the same themes over and over. And that brings me to my next point, which is you don't really have to look at Nexium or Twin Flames or Scientology or all these other things that are called cults. What's the other one? Jonestown. There's historic cults as well. I recently watched an interview with Rose McGowan, which was fascinating, where she talked about growing up in a cult in Italy and how a very similar thing. It all started with making the world a better place, and then before you know it, there's abuse happening, sexual abuse internally, not just with women, but with children. That's also always a theme. But again, one of my takeaways is you don't even need to look at religious ideology and these woo-woo sort of principles to think of something as a cult. I mean, the older I get, the more I realize there are these patterns in our society in other ways, in political systems. I mean, to me, there are elements to the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, that feels very cult-like. As I mentioned before, I've noticed patterns in the workplace where some companies, if you're not drinking the Kool-Aid, you're ostracized. I've been that person who was like the whistleblower, and it cost me a job. I mean, the job I had before my current one, I had made a video about it a couple years back that I got fired, and I knew I got fired and pushed out because I was not drinking the Kool-Aid. I was not willing to play the game. So this brings me to my next question, which is, are we all really just living in some version of a cult? And yet when we watch these shows, we're sort of judging like that could never be us, but really, are there cults we're a member of without even realizing it because we've so normalized the stuff that we deal with? Here's a great example. In America, people are very proud to be American. And yet when I compare it to the livelihood of, let's say, my cousins living in France, there are rights and privileges that they have that are not like up for debate. But in America, they're constantly up for debate. Like whether it's abortion rights, what a female can or cannot do with her body legally, or just even things like basic health care. Like I'm currently paying for my own health insurance out of pocket. And in certain countries, that's considered absurd. I mean, you don't even have to go to another continent. You can look at Canada. I'm pointing up at Canada. Canadians look at Americans like, what is wrong with you guys that you don't even have healthcare figured out? One could say it's a cult-like mindset to normalize that in a modern society, in a first world country, we are scraping by, some of us, just to make ends meet so that we can cover health insurance costs, which doesn't even mean that if tomorrow we have a huge accident that we won't have to pay for it. We're sort of like in bed with all these companies that we're constantly paying that don't actually have our back in the grand scheme of things. We're just a pawn in the system. I'm not saying this to complain about America specifically, living in the US. I'm saying this to point out, like, there are so many things that we do because everybody else is doing them around us. We don't really have a choice. You don't have a choice not to pay your taxes because you're not sure where the money is going, or you don't agree with, let's say, a war that your country is waging, or there's certain things that as a citizen, no matter where you live, you're just kind of required to do. I made a video a year or two ago about what it's like to be gay in Turkey and have to do military duty. In Turkey and in a lot of other countries, military duty is required for men. If you think about it, that's kind of cult-like, that you're forced to give up a year or two of your life to learn how to shoot a gun and be around other men, and you're fed, of course, any of these countries, not just Turkey specifically, you're fed propaganda when you're there. You're taught to really put your country first. That sounds kind of cult-like to me. So what other elements are we sort of blind to or not aware of are cult-like all around us? You don't have to join Nexium or Scientology or a mainstream religion even to have cult-like elements dictating what your life looks like. That's my final takeaway from this. This looks like it's going to be my longest video ever. If you stuck around this whole time, thank you. I hope this was interesting. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Please let me know what takeaways you have from Nexium or just topics related to cult culture. And I'll chat with you guys next time.